I'm Sam Ross. I'm one of the members of the steering committee of the Response Diversity Network, and so we have these roughly monthly seminars where members of the network have a chance to speak about their research. It doesn't have to be directly related to response diversity, just anything that kind of introduces themselves and their work, any kind of time from 30 minutes plus. Um, and so we started this just as an opportunity to try to get to know each other a bit better and hopefully form some natural kind of links and collaborations and things if you're interested in yeah what people are up to. You can just kind of reach out. And so today we have Professor Pete Manning, who's going to give us a talk. He's Professor of Global Change Ecology at the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Bergen, which is in Norway. But before then, he was at Germany for quite a long. It was Senckenberg, is that right, Pete?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, was there for quite a long time. And Pete's really had a really interesting and impactful career. Lots of really cool stuff on community ecology, particularly in terms of kind of plants as his main kind of study organism, and lots of work on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, and particularly multifunctionality. And I distinctly remember when Nature, Ecology, and Evolution was being launched in kind of 2018 or so. It seemed there was a string of these kind of multifunctionality papers in there, and Pete seemed to be on almost every one of them, which was great. So yeah, he's done lots of really great, really impactful work on this. But increasingly, as I think we're going to hear today, Pete said he's kind of interested in shifting more towards the kind of socio-ecological side of things, and thinking about ecosystem services and multi-service provisioning and this kind of stuff. And he's at least leading or co-leading a really cool project that they've got in Mount Kilimanjaro. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that, Pete. So please, whenever you're ready, just yeah, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for the great introduction, Sam, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak today. As Sam's already said, I came from a background of biodiversity and ecosystem function studies, and as time's gone on, I've increasingly incorporated ecosystem services and social aspects. I also still retain a very strong interest in doing fundamental ecology and trying to bridge that to social ecological studies. And that's what I'm hoping to demonstrate today, how areas of research like biodiversity, ecosystem functioning research can be connected to the social system. So I'm going to start with some older work from primarily from the Biodiversity Exploratories, but as Sam says, I'm also going to move to some more recent work that's been conducted on Mount Kilimanjaro, which you can see in these pictures here. So that's just a little teaser for what's to come. But I'm going to start back to the beginning, and that is that the whole area of biodiversity loss. And biodiversity loss, as we all know, it's occurring throughout the world. Here it is happening right here at a local scale in Norway, where we have the most rapid loss of nature in Europe currently. And there's a whole big body of ecological research describing these changes of land use change and also of biodiversity loss. And it's from this background that the BEF field emerged. So it was actually more than 30 years ago now, which is making me feel very old, that the first sort of big wave of biodiversity ecosystem function experiments was set up. And these were really, I think, coming from the question of if biodiversity is going extinct, obviously we're going to miss things like polar bears that we like and are charming, but the vast majority of biodiversity that doesn't have a sort of wildlife interest, what does it matter if that goes missing? And this was the overall foundation of biodiversity ecosystem function research. And a lot of big experiments were set up and a lot of big field studies conducted to address this question of how biodiversity loss might affect ecosystem functioning, with this idea that, humanity's kind of depending on it. And this led to many, many experiments. Here you can just see one meta-analysis of these experiments I was involved in with this classic relationship between the richness of communities and ecosystem functioning. Here it was plant productivity would be much higher where we had high levels of functioning. So this led to people to say, okay, this is great. Biodiversity is really important. We need to conserve it for the purposes of ecosystem functioning. But there was quite a bit of critique. So this is also quite an old paper now, but I think a lot of the arguments in it are still highly relevant. This was by Srivastava and Velend, and they were sort of saying in this paper that there was lots of things in biodiversity, ecosystem function research that made it difficult to translate the results to real world management. And some of these I've discussed in a sort of more updated version of the similar arguments in a recent paper. But one of the ones critiques which I'm going to concentrate on today, which they did make in this paper all the way back in 2005, was that there's not really any inherently good level of functioning. We tend to think of ecosystem functioning as being something that's desirable, but actually for a lot of ecosystem functions, there's nothing inherently good about, say, a high level of productivity or a high rate of decomposition. And obviously, they write here it's a potentially problematic concept, in part because the world function carries the unfortunate baggage of an implied purpose and an underlying assumption that particular levels can be unambiguously considered good. And the example they carry on drawing on is if we imagine, say, a grassland that has a high level of productivity, actually, if we were interested in conserving this species-rich grassland, we would probably want it to have a low level of productivity because a high level of productivity would lead to the exclusion of many of the species here. And so I think we often think of ecosystem functioning as being good. They're often treated interchangeably, functions and services, but they're not the same thing. And I would argue that as soon as we make a value judgment about a particular level of functioning, then what we're actually talking about is ecosystem services. So we need to think about what. So, yeah, more broadly, ecological research tends to stop at the level of biodiversity, ecosystem function, or ecosystem services. So we look often at global change drivers in ecology and how these affect ecological properties of functional composition and biodiversity, and how this affects ecosystem processes. And we do a lot of field studies and experiments to disentangle these different processes. But this approach leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And that is how ecosystem services, the actual things that we want from ecosystems, are influenced by these different properties. So I think this is key to understanding and managing biodiversity and biodiversity loss. This is all obviously going on within the context of biodiversity loss being accompanied by very strong land use change, which is the main driver of biodiversity loss. We've also got a resource-hungry society that's demanding multifunctional ecosystems. We want ecosystems to provide lots of things: food, recreational opportunities, carbon storage, and so on. And so this comes, when we put all this together, we're left with questions like what impact does biodiversity and land use change have on this multifunctionality? And how do we manage ecosystems and landscapes for this multifunctionality? And so we also need to ask, are the services that are affected by biodiversity and land use, are these actually important to society? Who's benefiting the most from biodiversity? And what impact does biodiversity loss and land use change have on different stakeholders and groups of people? Who are the winners and losers when biodiversity loss occurs? These are questions that we can't address within just ecology itself. We need to go beyond that into this interdisciplinary realm of ecosystem services if we're going to address these questions, which I think are often the ones that society really wants the answers to. And ecologists often sort of discuss these issues without necessarily measuring this social aspect. And this is what drew me into this area in the first place, was the desire to address these kinds of questions. So if we're going to think about these questions, we need to think about what the relationship is between ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services. Some ecosystem services are derived directly from biodiversity. We also need to look at the stakeholder community, the people who are benefiting from these services, what they actually want from the system, how important it is to them, and so on. So this and the fact that I was working a lot on ecosystem multifunctionality from a biodiversity ecosystem function perspective led to the publication of this paper, which Sam actually mentioned. This was some time ago now, in which we looked at ecosystem multifunctionality, and we defined it at the level of both ecosystem functioning, where there's no really inherently good level of function, and ecosystem services, where we want specific objectives from an ecosystem. And this ecosystem service perspective on multifunctionality is what I'm going to concentrate on today. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what this measure is, because I'll refer to it quite a bit throughout the talk. Ecosystem service multifunctionality is a metric which ranges between 0 and 1. And effectively what we do is we take the demand of services and we in a standardized way, and we multiply this by the level of supply to get a measure ranging from 0 to 1, which represents the supply of all ecosystem services relative to human demand. So if your multifunctionality scores 0, the ecosystem's provided nothing that you want from it. If it's as high as 1, then it's providing all the different benefits that you want. And I'm not going to go into the calculation of it, because it's and it may be a little tedious and takes up a little bit too much time, other than to say that we do take look at the level of supply of a particular service in an ecosystem or a landscape. We look at the benefit that it provides, and then we multiply this by demand scores, which we take from stakeholders, and we get this value between 0 and 1, representing how well the ecosystem delivers all those different benefits. I'm going to illustrate this with a simple example to begin with. So this is a study we published a few years ago now, in which we were looking at Prosopis invasion in Kenya. This is a tree which was introduced and has become an invasive species. It was introduced as a food source, I think, originally, but it's then become invasive and is covering large areas. And in this study, we asked, firstly, what the different priorities were of different stakeholders. So here we can see different stakeholder groups. This is what each of these pie charts represents. And these groups were asked to divide points at an individual level. So lots of people were surveyed, and they were asked to divide points of priority between all the different main ecosystem services. So everything from biodiversity and tourism to water, crops, livestock, wood, honey, shade, and other regulating services. And what we can see is that the priorities really differ strongly across groups. Charcoal producers, unsurprisingly, prioritize the production of wood. Those involved in conservation and tourism prioritized biodiversity and tourism. And then what we did is when we multiplied the supply measures, so using ecological data from plots where we have measures of these services across a gradient of this invasive plant, Prosopis, we can then calculate multifunctionality across this gradient. And we can see here, for example, that the charcoals producer sees their multifunctionality increase with the invasion of the Prosopis, whereas the other groups which prioritize the cultural services and biodiversity saw this decline in multifunctionality across this gradient. So we can see that this is a species which has positive effects for some stakeholder groups and negative effects for others. So in this case, this biodiversity change is creating both winners and losers. So this was just a simple example, and I'm going to go on to a more complex one. And this is from the large-scale and long-term German biodiversity Exploratories project. This is a huge project funded by the DFG. You can see the annual meeting of the project here and the number of people involved in it. And here we can see the biodiversity Exploratories 3 regions. Alb in the south, and in each of these regions there's 50 grassland plots and 50 forest plots. covering a full range of land use intensity. And on these plots, kind of almost everything you can imagine is measured. Also, I'm going to concentrate here on the grassland plots. In these plots, the farmers are giving estimates of grassland fertilization, mowing, and grazing every year, and this is used to make an index of land use intensity. So in one particular project from this study, this is called the BEF-UP project, we were basically looking at how spatial patterns of biodiversity across the landscape was influencing multifunctionality. So most BEF research looks at plot scale relationships and the role of spatial biodiversity dynamics and their interactions with surrounding land uses not really considered. And I would argue that this prevents us from upscaling plot level land use and biodiversity research to the large spatial scales that are often most relevant to management and policy decisions. So the question is, at these larger scales across the wider agricultural landscape, what role is biodiversity playing in supporting multifunctionality? So to address this question, we went to the plots. We took plant diversity and land use data across scales, a lot of data from the plot level, where we measure many different service indicators at the field level. So here we measured biodiversity surrounding each plot, and at the landscape level, where we looked at biodiversity within the wider landscape, or land use at least within the wider landscape. And we evaluated the effect directly and indirectly of these different forms of biodiversity on plot level ecosystem services, cultural services, above ground regulating services, above ground provisioning services, and below ground regulating services. And we looked to see how was alpha diversity supporting these. This is what most BEF research looks at. But we also looked at how gamma diversity and beta diversity in the wider landscape and the diversity of land cover in the wider landscape was also supporting these services. And we did this within a structural equations model framework, which you can see here, to evaluate how strong these different factors were in controlling ecosystem services, while also incorporating the impact of land use itself. What you can see here in these bars is the overall path strength from that diagram that you just saw, the structural equation model. What we saw was a strong and positive effect of the local and surrounding plant diversity on cultural ecosystem services. We can see this at the top here. Gamma diversity was important for cultural services. Both alpha and gamma diversity were important for above ground regulating services. And this was because in both these cases, surrounding diversity was sort of dispersing in, this is what we hypothesized, and supporting local diversity, but at the alpha scale, but it was also kind of like flying in and providing services from the surrounding area as well in the case of some of these services. We see a different case for above ground provisioning ecosystem services. Here we can see land use intensity is promoting these. This is why the farmer does it, because it promotes these services of forest production. And here diversity was actually negatively related with these services. For below ground services, it was more to do with the soil properties, how long the site had been a grassland since it was last tilled and so on. It was less dependent upon above ground diversity. So here we can see different groups of ecosystem services are responding differently to different elements of diversity and different elements of land use. And the question is, what's the net balance here? What's the overall effect? And who's actually winning and losing from this? And to evaluate that question, we need to actually go and conduct social surveys. So here we can see Sophie doing a workshop with stakeholders. We also conducted online surveys of the prioritization of different ecosystem services by the stakeholder communities. We incorporated this data, which you can see here, into our multifunctionality metrics. So here you can see the results of this prioritization survey. This is similar to the pie charts you saw earlier, but here in this case, we can see that most people are demanding a very wide spread of ecosystem services. Most different stakeholder groups here are prioritizing a very wide range of services, but their relative priorities differ quite a bit. Tourists, for example, um, have a high weighting on cultural services, while farmers, for example, have a high weighting of provisioning services. So if we take these measures into account in our study of spatial biodiversity and how it affects different multifunctionality scores, what we can do is combine these measures, both the demand data and the supply data, and to look at this ecosystem services, not just in the level of in the way in terms of supply, like we've seen, but in terms of multifunctionality for these different stakeholder groups. So what we see here is for local residents that plant gamma diversity was important for them, but so was land use intensity. But that's because they're prioritizing both those cultural services and those agricultural production services as well. So we can see that both biodiversity and land use intensity promote multifunctionality for them. We see a similar story for nature conservation, but because they're prioritizing cultural services and biodiversity more, the effects of biodiversity across scales are maybe strongest for them. What we do see, though, is even farmers, although the thing that's driving multifunctionality for them is land use intensity, even they're benefiting from gamma diversity. And that's because they do still prioritize those cultural services which depend on biodiversity. So the conclusion we came here is that biodiversity at a range of scales was positively influencing all the different stakeholder groups in this community. So I think this is a strong kind of conserve biodiversity message here, in that the whole stakeholder community was benefiting from biodiversity in some way. But what we do see is that some groups are benefiting from biodiversity more than others, and also that intensification benefits some groups more than others. And clearly this is the basis of the debates over land use within these areas. But what we do see is that if we can conserve diversity within landscapes, it would have positive effects on whole communities. So this was still looking at the plot level, though, and what I'm going to talk about now is we're moving up to scales now. I would argue that a lot of services can't be measured at the plot level. Do we really want, little pieces of grass that are multifunctional, or do we want whole landscapes that are multifunctional? I think this is where we need to be careful with how we interpret plot level multifunctionality measures. And to really address a lot of questions about multifunctionality, I think we need to move to the landscape scale and to address and to ask at the big landscape scale, what's the role of biodiversity in delivering all the different benefits across the landscape? And how would large-scale landscape change and biodiversity change affect society? These are, I think, some of the really key questions that society wants the answers to, and we need to do interdisciplinary, large-scale research if we're going to address these sorts of questions. So this is a study where we try to attempt to address these questions by moving upscale. And here what we did is we took the plot level data from the Exploratories and we simulated landscapes in which we took plots and combined them to see what their aggregated properties were in terms of ecosystem service provision. So what we did is we took the baseline landscape, the current landscape, if you like, and looked at the proportions of grasslands and forests and crops within that landscape, and then calculated landscape scale service supply and multifunctionality. And then we performed simulations where we can increase the amount of grassland, increase the amount of crops. We can de-intensify or intensify the landscape and do different it. And what we did here is we've got different services coming from different parts of the landscape, some from forests, some from grasslands, some from crops. And we've got, for all the different services which the stakeholders prioritized in those surveys, we've got different indicators taken from the plots and from combinations of the plots in order to represent multifunctionality. So we've taken a lot of indicators and measuring all different services of all kinds, both provisioning services, but also cultural services and regulating services are all going into this measure. What we argued is that we were going to try and find a landscape that would be both high in terms of the mean multifunctionality to something that would have high levels of multifunctionality to all stakeholders, but also equitable multifunctionality. So here that the degree of excuse me, the spread of multifunctionality will be fairly even across stakeholders. And if we looked at the current situation, then we're trying to find something that was up in this green corner that was both high in multifunctionality for all and equitable across them as well. And here we can see the some results from that. What Margot did in this simulation was she took every possible landscape that was possible and looked to see, just what's out there in space and where is the better landscapes, if you like, than the ones we've currently got. And you can see just up in the top corner, these are the few landscapes which were actually better than the current one in terms of multifunctionality and social equity. And the answer, what we can see here for all these dots are other alternative landscapes, is the current landscape's actually pretty close to optimum. It's almost as good as it can get in terms of meeting stakeholders' current demands of the landscape. There's a few which we can see in this orange space are a little bit better, but what we see is that most major land use changes would probably cause social problems. So we see lots of suggestions of, conserving huge amounts of semi-natural habitat, planting vast amounts of trees for carbon storage, or going for food security option where we increase food production at a local level. Most of these kinds of things which are proposed for landscapes would actually probably reduce the multifunctionality of the landscape in this case. What we can see when we dig into those scores here, we can see the contributions of all the different services to multifunctionality. We actually see that multifunctionality is pretty similar for most groups, though the contribution of the different services differ quite a bit. Here we can see the current landscape composition, and just to pull out two examples, here we can see two scenarios of change. One would be, say, optimizing for biodiversity. This is something which conservationists often propose. But here we can see that optimizing for biodiversity would actually cause a decline in, this would be an increase in semi-natural grasslands, low-intensity grasslands. This is where the biodiversity is found in these landscapes. If we increase the area of these a lot, we would actually see declines in a lot of services that people prioritize. And although we would see increased biodiversity, we would probably see reduced multifunctionality for most groups. The one case which is good for most of the stakeholder community with optimal multifunctionality and equity actually sees an increase in forest cover, an increase in low intensity grassland cover. But here we see, although the multifunctionality is increased, particularly for certain groups like those in the forestry sector and related stakeholder groups, that we actually see a decline in livestock production. And this would mean that if we were going to go for this optimal landscape, it would be a de-intensified landscape, but we'd need to, unless we reduce our demand for food, we would need to find food from elsewhere to meet this need. So what you probably noticed by now is that when we move up to this scale, we kind of lose the signal of biodiversity to a certain extent. But I think we can think of biodiversity here as being represented with the habitats types which are diverse. And I think a management scale or a management recommendation scale, that's actually okay to think of it at that level. So this is kind of what we've done up to now. And now I'm going to switch and show you a little bit more recent work. So far what I've shown with this multifunctionality approach is that we can link ecological change. Hopefully I've shown this in terms of biodiversity change and land use change to the supply of services and to the people that demand them. And we can do this in a quantitative way. So this is what we can see in this figure here is the IPBES framework. And we can think of this, if we look at the lower part here with the darker colors, within the IPBES framework, what ecologists do generally is they link direct drivers to nature. So we look at biodiversity loss, ecosystem change, and we also look at how nature change affects nature's contributions to people. Three of the sort of work that I've shown you via ecosystem services and BEF research. This is the kind of work that ecologists do. But this there's obviously the social system as well. There's people's quality of life. There's institutional change and so on. These aspects are part of the IPBES framework. They're clearly a key aspect to address in terms of understanding sustainability. But this work's typically done by social scientists in a way which is qualitative, and it's actually very difficult often to integrate it with ecological research and to combine it. So something we've been asking is, how do you actually assess the impact of changes to the social system on ecosystems? How do we integrate this information on change within the social system and change within the biological system in a way that's compatible and allows single quantitative tools to look at, for example, at the relative impact of changes to nature and changes within society. This is something which we've been starting to work on. And we've been adapting that multifunctionality framework that I've shown you to allow these sort of factors to come in. So here we can see a figure from a paper which hopefully will be out soon. And in this paper, what we're suggesting is that we can simulate, by playing with some of those numbers in the matrix, which I presented at the beginning, we can alter and simulate changes to things like land management. We can look at also changes to education and knowledge, subsidies, market changes, campaigning and advertising, things that might affect people's prioritization and relative demand for different services, and that we can simulate some of these changes within that framework that we presented. So I'm just going to show you now a little bit of example from the Kilimanjaro Social Ecological System project, where we're starting to look at this more integrated social ecological system and to place this biodiversity functioning and biodiversity services work within a social ecological systems approach and to embed it within this kind of research. And what we're doing within this big DFG funded research unit is to try and operationalize the entire IPBES framework. So if we think about this whole IPBES framework, what we're trying to do is to measure across the project in Kilimanjaro in a single place all different aspects of this system and to integrate them to get a holistic understanding of how this social ecological system functions. This is the overall design of the project. Across Kilimanjaro, this is obviously an enormous elevational gradient in which ecosystems change very strongly. We begin in the lowlands with savanna-type ecosystems and associated agricultural systems like maize bean cropping systems. As we move up the mountain, we go through coffee plantations, home gardens, which is a traditional agroforestry system, agricultural grasslands, and then we hit the national park boundary and we move to relatively undisturbed semi-natural ecosystems, primarily forest types of a montane forest, which sort of declines. The vegetation tends to get shorter as we go up, and eventually it shifts to the alpine ecosystems, which we see on the very top of Kilimanjaro. So across this project, there's 60 permanent plots, which were there present from a previous research project, which was more looking at the natural science side. And it already gathered a huge amount of data from these plots. We've also been taking additional measures on these plots and combining that with social sampling, which is also stratified across this huge elevational gradient with this large number of different stakeholder groups and farms which are spread across this region. So we've done social sampling, combined this with ecological sampling. And some of the work that we've been doing has been down at that more ecological end of the IPBES framework. So we've been doing work which is broadly comparable with a lot of BEF research, where we've been linking different biodiversity facets to major NCP. So, for example, Dixon's recently published some work linking different plant strategy axes to above ground carbon stocks. And we've done other work linking wood production and wood-based ecosystem services to these different biodiversity components as well. We've also been taking some more sort of novel approaches where we've been incorporating network ecology. Here we've taken the approach of taking the service and looking back down the interactions network to see which species are supporting the plants which provide ecosystem services. Here we can see used plants for medicine, food, and building materials, and we can see which species are involved in their seed dispersal via networks. So by this, we're looking deep down the interaction networks to see what biodiversity is underpinning services. But I have just shifted a little bit from my multifunctionality approach just to show you that we're also assessing which biodiversity is underpinning different services. But we're also conducting the multifunctionality approach. Here we can see the measures of demand and supply that we've taken. This is demand from the social surveys. Here we can see Nima talking to a farmer in the home gardens. And what we've got here, we see very strong differences in prioritization. For example, farmers are prioritizing material and NCP, broadly equivalent to provisioning services. Whereas, say, tourists are almost exclusively interested in cultural ecosystem services or non-material NCP, as they're called, with other groups like conservationists and tour guides showing a pattern which is kind of somewhere in between. We also see strong patterns in the supply across the mountain. For example, regulating services are often very high in the forest. Material services are also high in the forest and in certain agricultural systems. Non-material NCP, these are quite evenly spread across the mountain. So we see cultural ecosystem services across the whole mountain. And we can see here that this Kagani here is measuring, for example, the supply of food production, in this case, bananas in the home gardens. So we have a lot of ecosystem service indicators, which we can combine with this measures of demand to create these multifunctionality scores. And then what we've done is we've calculated multifunctionality, as you've seen before, but we're also looking at not just changes in the supply of ecosystem services in terms of land use, but also how does changes in the social system affect multifunctionality. So we've been looking at changes to access in terms of infrastructure in the park boundary, whether people can get into different ecosystems to access services, and also social change. If people differ or change in their prioritization of services, how would that affect their multifunctionality? And this was done according to scenarios which were done in participatory workshops, where local stakeholders were asked to envisage different futures for Mount Kilimanjaro, both positive and negative. And then we took those scenarios and implemented them in terms of how that might be reflected in demand change within this multifunctionality framework. So here we can see just a few examples. This is a change in access. So in the top, you can see the current situation and the multifunctionality of the different groups, farmers, conservationists, tour guides, and tourists. Across these different ecosystem types, we can see that certain ecosystem types are better for some groups than others. And that also that different ecosystem types provide different levels of service for these different groups. And in the lower level, what we can see is an access change where we've simulated access within the national park where local people would be able to come in and use provisioning services. Currently, they're banned from doing this. And also a case where tourists would have increased access to, for example, the home gardens, so they could come and enjoy some of the cultural benefits which those ecosystems provide. And so here we can see that actually increased access from either side of the national park boundary, tourism going into areas that they wouldn't currently go, and local people also going to areas they wouldn't go, would increase multifunctionality for both locals and tourists. There would obviously be challenges in managing this increased access, but at least we can see with this approach who would be benefiting and by how much with these kinds of changes. We're also looking at demand change, as I say, according to these different scenarios. We took one, which was an urbanized scenario. This is with an increased population and a kind of detachment from nature, if you like. And another scenario goes the opposite direction with a stable or declining population and a return to a more traditional life. These were scenarios which the local people themselves defined in participatory workshops. And what we can see here is that if we, for example, for farmers, if we go to an urbanized scenario, we see a sort of increased importance of food production, and those highly productive food producing ecosystems become even more important. Whereas, for example, another situation would be if we move to the traditional life, we see an increase in these blue cultural ecosystem services, these non-material NCP, and actually higher increases in multifunctionality overall. And so the overall picture that we see here, we can see from this lower set of figures, is that multifunctionality would increase quite strongly with a demand change towards more non-material benefits. We can also combine land use change with demand change, and here we can see that changes between certain ecosystem types would benefit certain groups more than others. We can see which land use changes would benefit who, and we can also combine this with demand change to see if the demand patterns and land use were changing, who would be winning and losing. And so what we can see here is that altered demand to a traditional life, coupled with a transition to home gardens from other agricultural systems, could increase multi. But we can start to show that we can, in addition to representing land use and biodiversity change with this approach, we can also explore scenarios of social change as well. So in conclusion, what I hope to have shown you, I guess the main point of my talk today was that if we link ecological measures, so the measures that we as ecologists take, to measures of social demand, then we can increase the relevance of ecological research to stakeholders and make conclusions about biodiversity and land use change that we wouldn't be able to from ecological studies alone. The approach that I've shown you is ecosystem service multifunctionality metrics. These can inform us of the overall impact of land use and biodiversity change on whole communities of people that incorporate multiple values. So how this differs from, I think, monetary ecosystem service assessment is we have all these cultural values, these things that are difficult to place a monetary value on, also incorporated into these measures. And so it's a more holistic and complete measure of ecosystem service provision than monetary assessment at all. What we see is that stakeholders do demand multifunctional ecosystems, though they clearly have their favorite services, which causes trade-offs in management. But multifunctionality metrics allow us to identify land use options that can achieve multifunctionality for whole communities, or at least allow us to understand what the trade-offs are and who's winning and losing under different land management scenarios. We can also use this approach, I think, to demonstrate impact of future changes to demand and to access, and to also potentially inform decision making. And I think these can be used as a kind of tool in participatory processes about how we manage land. I also think, and this is just something which I hope to have shown we're just starting to understand, I think we can extend this approach into governance and maybe even into different values, different perceptions, and also maybe linking these multifunctionality measures to human well-being. Then I think we can take this approach even further and demonstrate social impact of ecological change even more strongly. So to finish, I want to thank the huge number of people that did the work today. Gitan, Sophie, Larry, Margot, Nima, Dominic, Netra, Tio, Eric, Fons, Marcus, Kagani, Dixon, Giovanni, and lots of others. There's really far too many people to mention. I've mentioned a whole load of studies with a massive amount of people working on them. And the kind of work that I've been showing today isn't possible without these huge team efforts. So I want to thank all the people that contributed to the work that I presented today, which allows this kind of work to be made possible. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll happily take any questions. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pete. That was a really fantastic talk. Yeah, really, really enjoyed that. Lots of very interesting, multi-dimensional aspects there from all kinds of sides. Oh, excuse my cat. Um, so questions from the audience. As I said earlier, if you don't want to appear on the video, you can write your questions in the chat and I'll read them to Pete. There was, yeah, already a note from Danny Montoya in the chat saying he couldn't stay, but thanks for the nice talk. So there's one. Oh, Mike, go ahead.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Pete. That was a great introduction to all this work. Um, I'm going to apologize in advance for this question because it's really administrative rather than ecological or social sciences.
Mhm.
But I need tips and I need advice because I'm now starting a kind of long-term cross-disciplinary project on
Mm.
biophilic living, which has got a lot of similar elements, right? We want multifunctional outcomes
Mhm.
from this. We want to understand what attracts people to living in these sort of situations and things. So
Mhm.
the project is working with all the disciplines, right? Psychologists,
Mhm.
architects, anthropologists, English
Yeah.
literature people. How have you managed such a diverse team in your experience? What kind of top tips can you give us for that? Because it's really challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it is really challenging, and it's very difficult to work without drifting off into your disciplinary silos. And obviously, there's a challenge in communicating and in understanding each other's priorities. I guess you need to retain a flexibility and an open-mindedness and interest in other people's methods and approaches and languages, and also a little bit of patience to understand each other is required. As I say, it is difficult to tie everyone together. I think if you need a certain amount of agreed frameworks, I think working together on the same plots, on the same study units, this helps tie it down so that you've got at least some sort of shared study objects that you can then transfer data between. Also, shared theoretical frameworks. Obviously, I've been presenting a particular one, which allows quite a lot of, not every element to be brought in, but many elements to be brought in. But I think if people are going to work on that kind of framework, they also need to agree that, yeah, okay, we are going to try and keep to the methodology so that we can do this shared work. And I guess there's a certain amount of communicating the value added of doing work which combines these different elements. But yeah, it's always going to be a challenge. I think people are getting more used to doing this interdisciplinary work and even transdisciplinary work. But yeah, it's obviously not without its challenges. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot for that.
Thanks, Pete. I think we're going next to the Zurich gang. I don't know who specifically it is there, but Owen, Francesco, someone.
Hi, Pete. It was me.
Hi.
Thanks very much. Really exciting work. There was a slide earlier on about agricultural sector and tourism sector was the top and lower part. I think it was about their demand.
I'm sorry, Owen, you froze on me. You were just about to ask
Hear me
something
now?
and you froze. Yeah.
You hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, there was a slide earlier on. Oh, I don't know if you've heard me thanking you for a really nice presentation and really exciting
I
work.
think I did do that bit. Thanks.
There was a slide earlier on with the top part about agricultural sector and the bottom about tourism sector, and I think it was
Hmm.
about demand
Hmm.
relative relative demand, and there was some negative.
Mm-hmm.
There were bars going across which were positive, and then some
Mm-hmm.
negative.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm only picking on the agricultural sector because it's up here.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a positive for plant gamma diversity and a negative for land
Mm-hmm.
diversity. And I'm
For
kind of like,
plant which diversity? Sorry, the
I saw,
negative for which one?
saw a positive for plant
Uh-huh.
diversity and a
Mm-hmm.
negative for land cover diversity. And it's
Right, yeah.
those two demand preferences are kind of potentially opposing each other. And so the
Mm-hmm.
question is more general about like, how do, I mean, does one sometimes see these demand profiles kind of being somewhat difficult to accommodate given the processes that are shaping?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, it absolutely is. So, I mean, what we also just one thing I didn't highlight, but it's there always in these scores, is you can see that the multifunctionality score is almost always under zero point 0.5, which means that what everything that you want is just not possible, even in the best possible case that we can find. And that's because people want things which inherently trade off against each other. So if you want high biodiversity and you want high agricultural production, then those have opposing drivers which pull the system in opposing directions, and you can't have the highest possible multifunctionality. So what you're seeing here is the net balance of everything that they said they wanted, and and all the things that drive it, which also go in opposing directions. But you're sort of seeing the net balance of these things, and so yeah, there's some services that you want are going to be promoted by those factors, and other services that you want are going to be responding negatively to those factors. What we're seeing here is the kind of net balance of everything. So, but what you wouldn't get is obviously high levels of everything. I don't know if that answers your question or not. But yeah,
Yeah,
you can't, there isn't an ideal landscape. There isn't a way of optimizing. It's about minimizing the trade-offs.
but there is an ideal
Hmm.
demand file.
The ideal demand profile is one which matches the current supply perfectly. Yeah.
or the or the or the trade-offs in the supply and the trade-offs in the supply, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And this is where I actually think, and this is why we're also looking at this demand aspect, is because there isn't an optimal landscape, but we can actually get a sort of reduced conflict in theory via demand management, where people actually sort of agree, to yeah. And I think this is maybe reflected a little bit in the German scores, where it's been a biosphere reserve or a national park where people have had to mediate their demands a little bit to meet each other, and that's why they've all got quite similar demand, and the trade-offs aren't quite so big. So I think demand management is key to this land management issue. And actually, there's something we're investigating in social survey work, is what are the actual levers and drivers of this demand? What are the social factors that cause these demand patterns, and how can we manage them? I think this is key to addressing these issues.
Super. Thanks very much, Pete.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. Oh yeah, Ottaviani, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks a lot um, for this beautiful talk, and especially I really enjoyed the Kilimanjaro experiment. Let's say is really amazing, and also seeing all this the elevational gradient with all the different biomes and how people are
Mm.
actually interacting is really amazing. I've got actually a question about previous slides where you were in the end showing that kind of in the relationship between, I think, provision of multifunctionality and equity
Mhm.
for, I guess it was for in Norway or in Germany. Sorry if I
Mhm.
missed that part,
Yeah.
but you were suggesting kind of increasing the forest size
Mhm.
of different types.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm not saying that is wrong, and I'm not saying that you claim for
Mhm.
afforesting everything. I mean, I'm not, but how would you? It's kind of my curiosity because there is a big
Mhm.
debate
Mm-hmm.
worldwide about, like foresting, open biomes, like semi-natural grassland, temperate grasslands.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, and this is also related to which metrics of below ground multifunctionality, which I didn't get how you were measuring,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe I missed something.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you feel about this? I mean, in other words, if this message could be taken by people to kind of stakeholders to say, okay, let's go for, plantations.
Yeah, to explain the outcome, I've just gone back to a share screen again, and here you can see the baseline, if you like, in this slide here, and we can see that the lowest multifunctionality was actually those involved in forestry. Here we can see this is the top, the green bars here, and part B, current landscape multifunctionality. These groups are the ones which had the lowest multifunctionality relative to their, obviously it's all relative to their demand under the current situation. And so what we see is if we increase forest cover, the services that they're demanding are reach a higher level. And this is what we see in the next slide, where we increase forest cover, particularly mixed and coniferous forest. And we see in this lower part H here, it's in the bottom corner. We see that these services, the forest-based services, which was hunting and timber production, these are and carbon storage. These are increasing quite a bit. That's meeting their needs more. So this group, which had the lowest multifunctionality, is raised, while the others don't see a particularly low reduction in their own multifunctionality. Except for those who like livestock production, because what we're losing here to make space for this forest is primarily intensive grassland. So yeah, this would obviously be a case where we could say, okay, you could do this in Germany. You could probably increase carbon storage and timber production. It would come at a food cost, but yeah, you'd need to either reduce your demand for food. Again, this is about demand management, or we have to get it from somewhere else in the world where it's probably going to bring its own problems in some other part of the world. If we're importing soy instead of feeding them grass from German grasslands. So there's here, we see the issue that this is only looking at a local scale. We're not looking at the kind of telecoupling of services, but we do see that if we wanted to improve things for local German stakeholders, this is an option, but we can at least see what you would gain and lose and who would gain and lose. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's great. Thanks a lot. It was
Okay,
like curiosity, and
thanks.
thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Pete, for that answer as well. Yeah, I mean, I could ask you an hour's worth of questions about the trade-offs between all of these things. I find it absolutely fascinating to look at all the moving parts with this. But in the interest of time, I think we should probably stop there. But thank you so much, Pete, for the fantastic talk. And yeah, if everyone please join me again in thanking Pete for a great seminar, which I will pop up on YouTube in due course. Yeah, this is the last one of the year because the last week in December nobody's going to be doing this. So let's reconvene in towards the end of January, and I hope everyone has a good end to the year.
Sam,
Thanks, everyone. Oh yeah,
very quickly, just it might be worth reminding people about the BES session.
yep, great idea.
It might count as the last seminar of the year.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so Francesco, who's here, actually is co-organizing a seminar with Charlie Kuntzer, who was one of our speakers earlier in the year as well, on response diversity at the British Ecological Society's annual meeting in Edinburgh in a few weeks in December. So if anybody's going to be around, quite a lot of people from the network are going to be there, and it'll be a good opportunity to interact with people, meet people. Do come to the session, hear the scientific part, but also hang around for the fun part as well. Not that the science isn't fun; the science is very fun. So yeah, anything else, Francesca? Do you need to say anything else about that?
Not really. Just hope to see many of you there.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, everyone.